Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Clare Hall for those who are not natural inhabitants of the college, and a particular welcome to those who have come from overseas to see what is the probably the most interesting Cambridge college, and certainly the most interesting Cambridge college of the last half century. As we all know, the most important thing about Clare Hall, or two most important things about Clare Hall, are first of all that we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, so it's good that we should be celebrating the architecture. And secondly, that Clare Hall is really about its people. But while we think that Clare Hall is about its people, we must remember too that the people only function in the context of the architecture of the building. And whilst we like to think that Clare Hall's ethos is something that which was developed by the fellows of the college 50 years ago, we know actually quite a lot of the ethos of the college was in the head of Ralph Erskine, thinking of what a modern college would be like. Traditional Cambridge colleges built on typically large-scale courtyards with vertical staircases in them were calculated effectively to prevent interaction between people, except in formal social spaces, typically the college hall. Clare Hall was on a completely different model, that the whole college is designed in order to facilitate interaction. And Erskine himself had seen that within a proper academic community, at least a proper academic community as he saw it in the 20th century, it was the interaction between people, their opportunity to speak to each other, to discuss with each other, to join together in academic events, that really characterised what the academic community was. So we, as a college, owe a great deal to him. Of course, things have changed slightly over the intervening 50 years. We've not kept every building precisely as he had planned it, but we've been remarkably true, I think, to the underlying ideas which he had had. And the things which have been written in the catalogue and in our 50th anniversary book about the architecture have brought home to many of us just how much the architecture tells us of what the ethos of the college is. So it's a great pleasure that we should have this symposium and that we should have the exhibition of Erskine drawings, which will be opened this afternoon. Now, the reason I have a piece of paper in my hand is not that I need a piece of paper to say welcome, but I need to say thank you to a number of people, and I want to ensure that I've not forgotten all the people. The most important person, I think, I hope he'll forgive me for saying he's the most important, is Alan Short, the Professor of Architecture. Alan came to these buildings as a student in the 1970s and has lived largely with the Erskine architecture ever since. And it was his initiative that we should have this event. So we're very grateful to Alan, both for having the initiative and carrying on seeing it through to completion. Alan brought on board Elaine Harwood and Tony McGurk, and they've both been absolutely invaluable in guiding the exhibition. So we're very grateful to them. Clare Hall is an odd college, so we have our own Anglo-Swedish person in Marie Jansson, the development director, who was able to use her understanding of Sweden, the Swedish language, she is Swedish, in order to track down the Erskine drawings in Stockholm in the Museum of Architecture and Design and arrange that we could have access to these. She was able to convince them as well that we were a worthy recipient of some willingness and generosity on their part. So we're very grateful to Marie. The serious business of organising the details of the exhibition are in two people's hands. One of our research fellows, Lucia Tantadini, who was here somewhere, lurking at the back, and a research fellow a visiting fellow, sorry, Antonelli Alici, who works on Erskine, and I think when he applied for a visiting fellowship here, didn't actually realise that one of the conditions of his coming here was that he'd be organising a whole exhibition devoted to Erskine. They were responsible for the hanging of the display. They're largely responsible for the catalogue, which you should all have. Gabriel Bing, another research fellow who is here somewhere, also lurking at the back, did a good deal of work collating the documentation, going through the archives, sniffing out some of the things that were there. Our two assistants, that's the right word, although sometimes I think they're not assistants, in the development office, Catherine Wise and Erica Emon, did a huge amount of work, both in terms of practical organisation and also in terms of going into the archives, ferreting around and finding some wonderful images, drawings there, which might otherwise have got lost. I won't say above all, but importantly, we're very grateful to our sponsors, and in particular Skanska, who have made the exhibition financially possible. We will say thanks again to them this afternoon. And from the college's point of view, we're also very grateful to the Swedish Embassy for giving us support, both moral support and support of personnel. The cultural attaché, Ellen Westermark, will be here this afternoon to open the exhibition. So I hope you all have a really good time here, a really interesting time here, and it's something which will reflect well on the memory of Ralph Erskine as the architect of Clare Hall, both in terms of its physical buildings and in terms of its collegiate ethos. So welcome to everybody.
Well, yes, can I add to that welcome? So I'm Alan Short, and the President's given a very sophisticated architectural introduction to the project, wonderful for a lawyer. So we have a very packed day because, in a way, things have escalated since we started organising it, and the symposium's organised in 3 parts with refreshments and a Anglo-Swedish lunch in between the different parts. So in part 1, we have a very distinguished panel, and we're going to hear about the whole business of founding the college, the idea of the college, which was incredibly radical at the time, and how it's set into the context of what was happening in college and university architecture. Then we're going to have a break, have coffee, and then we're going to hear about what it was like actually being a resident, one of the earlier residents of the college, and whether the vision actually worked, whether it transformed and grew. And then after lunch, we're going to have an afternoon about to look at the broader picture, the legacy of Erskine's design, and it emerges, which I didn't know, that Erskine was very active in Italy in subsequent years, and we're going to hear about that. And Dick Van Gemeren from Meccano is going to talk about, as Professor of Housing at Delft, is going to talk about his influence, and our sponsor, Skanska, had a long-term relationship building Erskine's building. We'll be coming to tell us about that. And then it's a slightly odd day because you have to contain yourselves with a terrific exhibition waiting to see on elsewhere in the college.
Then we'll try. Because I feel I'm here under very false pretenses, because what I'm going to tell you about is what Clare Hall didn't do. And the picture of all the colleges, university accommodation being built mainly for undergraduate students, into which Clare offered a complete reaction. And that's really the important message to get across. So let's have a look at university architecture in 1945, and I give you the not so inspiring St Anne's College, Oxford, with apologies to Oxford people, begun before the war by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, and completed after it. So it seems to be a perfect place to start. And you can see the Cotswold rubble, which cursed Oxford building for many, many years. The traditional style, it was demanded. You know, when Nuffield College produced a rather Byzantine scheme, and William Morris Nuffield said, but where are the spikes, where are the points, where are the gargoyles? This is what I'm paying for. And they had to go back and produce a traditional scheme. And at Cambridge, you see A. Richardson's Chancellor's Building at Christ's College of 1950, on the site where Walter Gropius was proposed should build a modern design. Still firmly classical, stripped of all its detail, quite resplendent in its way, but very much the tried and tested old route. And if you go to Downing, you see the history of post-war classicism carrying on through Herbert Baker and his many assistants, and then in the work of Quinlan Terry. And so it was a radical thing when, in 1952, the arts faculty proposed to work with Casson and Condor, Hugh Casson, who'd made his reputation with the Festival of Britain, for the simple reason that modernist buildings could be built in sections as the money was found. And it wasn't so obvious if there was a wing missing for a time than in a classical building. And that is why Casson and Condor's buildings were preferred to those by Robert Atkinson and A. Anderson, his assistant, which were in a much more traditional Swedish classical style. And it's really, Cambridge has one huge advantage over Oxford. A school of architecture, thank you. So that it, thank you, Alan. I know my friends are. And it meant that there were architects on hand who understood what university building was all about. And the first of these to come forward in the post-war period really was David Roberts, when in 1952 again, Magdalen College decided not to continue with its long-standing scheme of building with Benson Court to the designs of Edwin Lutyens. And Roberts advised retaining some of the old buildings, and into which he stitched a small modern block, this rather festival-like F&G staircases. And you probably know much better his work on the riverside. One of his 3 listed buildings, 2 of which are in Cambridge, the Boat House for Sydney, Sussex and Corpus Christi, into which Gerston and Wolfson have since invaded, hence the 4 flagpoles, 1958. But it's really here with the Queen's College and the Erasmus building that the college buildings began to go modern with a vengeance, because this is right on the back, so you can. All those dreadful guys that do the guided tours in punks are really rude about it, even to this day. And it caused a great stir when Stephen Dykes Bauer's scheme for this site of Queen's was chucked out. And Sir Basil Spence, the new establishment figure following and then building Coventry Cathedral, gets this commission in 1959. And yes, it's on Pilotti, you can see through it, it relates to the older buildings, and it's got a solidity and maturity about it that seems to combine traditional and modern elements really rather well, despite, I think, younger architects then coming in turn to malign Basil Spence as the old fogey of his day, not least because he'd worked with Lutyens in the past. So, but really, I think the change comes to Cambridge when Leslie Martin is appointed Professor of Architecture at the department in 1956. He brings with him from the London County Council Colin St. John Wilson as assistant teacher and associate inverted commas, so not quite a partner, rather more than an assistant in practice. And Martin's way of working was very much to encourage ideas through younger, talented people within a sort of ideas umbrella over which he had control. And this work is clearly credited to Wilson, with Alex Harvey, the services tutor, and a lot of the third-year students whose project this was. And there it still is, complete with its lovely raw concrete stand for showing the slides. It's not so lovely, beautiful, but exceedingly uncomfortable chairs and so forth. And this was opened by no less than Le Corbusier himself in 1959. And it marks this sort of British brutalist style at its most perfect that Smithson's had been written in 55 about the use of natural materials, including brick and timber as well as concrete, in an honest way. So no rendered walls, timber, brick, concrete exposed, and this is what the original meaning of brutalism was, that was then taken to mean those very big, powerful, chunky buildings that were being constructed by the time that Bannon's book on the new brutalism was published. So that new brutalism is a useful term for this style of architecture. Meanwhile, and more importantly, Martin and Wilson had both become under the thrall of Alva Aalto, who'd also come over to lecture. And a lot of their buildings show Aalto's influence extremely palpably. So here's a very early building for graduate students in Cambridge, looking rather remarkably like Aalto's St. Axelo South Town Hall, with the steps there. I should have put my own slide in, but the steps were missing when I went to St. Axelo. So you have the 20th Century Society climbing up a slope of mud, not so good. And Martin then goes over to Oxford to advise them on new buildings and steals the job and gets the job of building some cross libraries for economics, English and law. There's the law library. And out of this design starts to emerge the designs for the British Library. If you know the humanities libraries in the British Library, they have this sticking out L formation. And Martin talks about following Aalto's line in taking a design for a building type and evolving it rather than thinking each one out afresh. But universities were primarily building for undergraduates in 1960s. We have a statistics moment here. 1960, 22 universities and 4 university colleges in the United Kingdom. Between 1961 and 1968, 24 more universities were either founded from scratch or torn out of older institutions, or were university colleges that were upgraded. In 1962-3, 118,400 students. By 1966-7, that's only in 4 years, 154,700. Oxford and Cambridge in 1962-3, 17,900. By 1966-7, 20,440, despite the push being given to the red bricks and to new universities. And one of the reasons is this building of new colleges like Churchill, to which we've already heard mention, where Martin comes out as being this so eminent Greece whose main role in directing the way British architecture evolves through the 60s is in recommending young architects for interview and competition to university colleges, to New Hall as well, and New College Oxford, at Churchill. He recommends 20 firms who small, local, large, national, who are then do a two-stage competition, out of which Richard Shepherd and partners later Shepherd Robson win. Perhaps there's the dining hall with a massive scale. Compare the scale of that, the biggest hall in Cambridge, to the room we're in now, and you see something of the difference. But this was architecture, it said in the brief, architecture to last 400 years. And this is really where the modern architecture in Britain starts to move away from simply building schools and houses and factories into producing public buildings of a monumental scale, designed, as the brief said, to take their place in Cambridge, to be of their own period, but to last 400 years. And this is where the modern architecture starts. I think more telling, perhaps, was the scheme that came second by Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amis, that was a real success, their scheme, for a very young British practice, and led to them, here's a better view of the project. The island was supposed to have Winston Churchill's tomb on it. An ice skating pond was a part of the brief, so water becomes important. And it leads to work for HKPA at St Anne's, at Oxford, and at Birmingham, and where the red brick universities were expanding very rapidly indeed, trying to even up the balance between the provinces, London and Oxford and Cambridge, 61-2. And other competition entrants were Chamberlain, Powell and Bonn, who worked at New Hall, now Murray Edwards, and did a huge campus at Leeds that made it the biggest university of the 60s and 70s. And Dennis Lasdon, who Martin later recommended to work at the University of East Anglia. So where does that leave graduates? Moments of facts number 2 and last. The academic staff who were not fellows at Cambridge were 45% of the academic staff by 1961-2, so unattached to a hall, and 916 research students unattached to a college. And the Bridges Syndicate in 1960-62 recommended building University Centre, 1964-7, Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amis. Meanwhile, the university builds Wolfson, University College, now Wolfson College, for which you'll be pleased to know I don't have a picture. And it's so horrible. Following the publication of the report, John Bradfield, senior bursar at Trinity, proposed to colleagues at St John's, Caius and King's that those 4 colleges might found a college of fellows aided by a nice British Rail signal failure just outside Cambridge Station that forced them to talk for quite a whole afternoon. King's pulls out and does its own thing. So there's the interior of the graduate centre. But the rest of them produce Darwin College, again 1964-9, when it's finally opened. Architects again, Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amis, with this resplendent dining hall addition to older buildings owned by the Darwin family that Bradfield was able to secure. And there's the dining hall there for comparison with the grandparents here. And Clare Hall comes along in the same era, with Clare College doing its own thing, Eden steering the direction it took, as you heard, into this family centre rather than a conventional graduate college. And I leave you with a picture from when I met Ralph Erskine and a reminder that until this time, Erskine too had really been building houses, Utop, a factory, little mill town in northern Sweden, central Sweden, and housing as at nearby Sandviken. This is Barbara, more or less the same date as here. So something very different and to the norm was obviously rooted here. Thank you. Badly, I forgot to show the key picture. This is in Richard Stafford Smith went over to study housing in Sweden, saw Erskine's work, met Erskine and invited him over to produce this project for the college's proposals for the land holding it had north of Parker's Piece over here. And Erskine ends up trying to patch up the relations between the town and university factions and produces his own scheme. And it's this that leads him to be introduced to the Cambridge fraternity and for his name to be suggested for the building here. What I haven't found, I don't know if anybody in this room has, is whether who the other 4 candidates were who were interviewed. That you're looking not knowledgeable over here, but that is something that I would very much like to know. So apologies for the false ending. That's the key linking piece. Thank you.
Well, to begin with, a bit of necessary background. Ralph was born in 1914 in Mill Hill, suburb of London, in a middle-class family with a Scottish roots. Both his parents were Quakers, and in due order they put Ralph into a Quaker school. As you well know, Quakers have no priests. They just sit down silently praying and contemplating, whereupon one of them interprets the feeling of the meeting, and that's it. Ralph, I believe, early developed a talent for that interpreter role and practiced it during his whole life and career. Early at school, he met his canon wife, Ruth. Ralph went to Northern Polytechnics in London to study architecture, graduated in 1937 and started to work for a well-established firm named Forgotten. But he only found out that that wasn't his future. So he took off to Sweden, where things in these days were happening both in architecture and in politics. He did it by bike, spring 1939. This was half a year after Mr. Chamberlain proudly had declared peace in our time after meeting Hitler in Munich. Mr. Chamberlain, as we well know, proved wrong. Ralph, with his Quaker background, contemplated to join some kind of ambulance brigade, but was after consultation with his former teacher advised not to. Stay put in Sweden. Ruth went over by train. As you well know, Sweden managed to stay out of the war, but was of course affected. Not much of building went on, for example. Ralph and Ruth survived on a low budget. In these days, a piano was an indispensable element in any upper or middle class family. Pianos were delivered in wooden boxes. Ralph collected a decent number of these boxes, with which he, supplemented with some other building material collected in a similar way, built a house in the forest south of Stockholm. Well, rather a hut, where all required functions were squeezed in on 25 square meters. Ralph went by bike or ski some kilometers through the forest to train station, then the train to Stockholm and the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, section architecture. There he made for his future very valuable contacts with both Swedish and foreign colleagues. The original hut named the box is no more, but a perfect replica was built about 40 years later near his new home in Drottningholm. From that you have a view over the open fields and all the way to the medieval church and its churchyard where Ralph and Ruth now are resting. But back to the 40s. That one.
The big one.
Yes, okay. Dog and Ralph.
The dartboard's rather dangerous.
Well, it was Anders Tengblom. He remained a close friend in all of Ralph's life, and they met at the academy. Who helped Ralph and Ruth to their new home in Drottningholm because the box became too cramped. They managed to rent the upper floor of a wooden house with a veranda, and there he established a small practice. And with the help of Anders, he also got his first commissions, doing some additions, doing a series of small industrial communities in mid-Sweden. He also came to be Europe's first indoor shopping centre up in Luleå in the 50s. But there were several of these very nice projects still alive and very livable in mid-Sweden. That's the forest version. But now the veranda wasn't big enough, which made Ralph do yet another unconventional investment. He bought Verona, a 30-meter long, 70 to 80 years old Thames barge, with flat-bottom lee booms and 350 square meters of sails. With the help of some friends and a constantly drunk hired captain, he brought it over to Sweden. He raised the hatches, opened the cargo room, and thus obtained a top-lit open space, a studio, holding some 8 drawing desks and a proper space for both secretary and tea drinking. And these are the drawings of that project. Warmed by 2 ever-whistling big paraffin heaters, and unfortunately, as it proved later, insulated by sheets of foam plastic, it became a year-round office, which, when summer arrived, with staff and families and necessary equipment and everything, sailed off into the Stockholm archipelago to return late August. Ralph early developed a keen interest in what he called climatic architecture, architecture appropriate for the... Yeah, well, here is Verona resting in Drottningholm. Architecture adopted for the northern climate, subarctic zone as he called it. And in that, Ralph included the most of Sweden, in fact. He also developed close relations with radical young European architecture in the informal group named CIM. Here are examples of his studies for climatic architecture with the hanging balconies, the unbroken exterior, etc., etc. And if you see this picture, you can, this is in principle Clare Hall. Now, of course, you don't have the snow, you have the rain. And of course, the sun comes from the south. It does in Sweden, and when there is sun in northern Sweden, and in England. So, you know, he used the slope, he made a protective wall against the north, and then dense community within the sheltered by that wall, etc. So that was one of his main ingredient, which he made that in all his architecture. Here is another example, built example actually, of a house with a minimum of external walls and roofs, etc. It was very modern in this case. That's what's been talked about today. Here we have the CIM group. Well, and this is dropping off. In the early 60s, then Ralph managed to buy the lower apple garden of the premises where he had been dwelling and had his office. This was here is his house. That's the house which he rented with the veranda, and that what became his farm, his house. In 1969, the house was built, and in 1963, the office, both on solid ground, here under construction and here finished. With a very nice interior, curved roof, one big volume indoors. That's his desk. That's the the center of the building. There he was controlling both work and family and everything. The open stove in the middle. The house is existing still there. His granddaughter lives there now, which was a very happy solution. Now, at last, into what became Clare Hall. It was late in the evening, the early summer 1966. After my first holiday week, I joined the office at the age of 22 in the fall autumn of 1965. Now we are early summer 1966. I was returning after a holiday week. The telephone rang. My then girlfriend, Marianne, students of architecture, love of my youth, we were back after a week-long study trip to Netherlands in her mother's borrowed Austrian Mini. We were staying overnight in the parents' traditional summer house in the beechwood forest close to Lund in Skåne in southern Sweden, which is, we have a plan of the house and another project we can leave that behind. Well, we were down here somewhere. Well, I had, of course, we were called to meet, to cancel all holiday plans. Panic. We had to go to longitude latitude in the Finnish archipelago, an island called Kyrka. What had happened? Well, I had, of course, observed that the office had a major commission that occupied most of Ralph's attention. It was the prestigious challenge to design Clare Hall in Cambridge, of all places in his homeland, being in fact his first international commission. However, so far I had not been involved. It was Michael Linnett, keen fan of Ralph, with RAF moustache and everything. Myself, I was a very young architect in the 60s, naturally. And in the 60s, you remember a decennium, which was where people were expected to be in opposition to all kinds of authorities. I worked on other projects. Ralph was at the time a bit fed up with all these people around him that said yes to everything he proposed. He found me a most welcome alternative. Arguments were thus, in his opinion, good sports. After all, he was British. Well, called up in the middle of the night over the phone, I answered, "We are coming." Implicit, I will bring my girlfriend along. So we took off. Car to Lund, train to Stockholm. Then, ferry to Åland, bus over the island, another ferry and another bus, and there we were, which was there. We then learned more about what had occurred. Ralph, honoured by his prestigious commission, had been slightly carried away, producing ever more elaborated, inspiring, challenging sets of sketches. You can see them now in the exhibition. He had gone to Cambridge time after time. There was, however, one thing he had forgotten. So when he appeared yet another time in the early summer, the time the chairman of the building committee had said, "Well, that's all very nice, Mr. Erskine, but where's the final design?" Here I have to put in that the final design is a set of drawings in proper scale with straight lines and dimensions supported by a bunch of principal detail, illustrated lists of windows and doors, etc., etc., containing all the information required for structural engineers, quantity surveyors, and all other partners needed to produce a proper set of documents required to go out to tender for getting a contract. These documents were, to put it shortly, badly required in 3 weeks' time. So there we were, about 7 of us, 7 or 8 maybe. Some of them from the office, some other people who happened to be saving with Ralph. There was a mechanical engineer, he was good at drawing. It was all around midsummer. Sun raised at about 3 o'clock. We did it about 5, started working at 6. Sunset about 11 in the evening, and so did we. Ruth produced delicate lunches and dinners out of pie and sausages, the only basic ingredients that safely could be obtained from the local fishermen and the little shop on the island. The second pike and the second sausage meal was not the previous lie, and so it went along. Ralph was sitting in the galley from our lower position. Here it was like this when we came, because it was sort of a summer holiday set up. We'll see another picture later what it looks afterwards. Ralph was sitting in the galley. From our lower position we could only see his feet and legs, and on tracing paper producing ever more new sketches, which in due course tossed down to us to transform them into drawings. It was obvious that the operation called for some kind of organization. Ralph gave me the responsibility. The first problem we had was that we lacked proper rulers. These days, Britain hadn't yet gone metric, something they later did, inch by inch, as you know. So we were to dimension this rather complex set of buildings constituted the project anyway, horizontally and vertically, in feet and inches, in scale 1/4 of an inch, which meant 1 to 48 in our world, and 1/8 of an inch, which meant 1 to 96. Okay, no electricity, but there was a telephone booth in the harbour very on our line. So Ralph made a call to London, and within 36 hours, the hydroplane landed side by side to our floating office, duly delivering a bunch of proper rulers. Funny British skills. Now work went on orderly. In cases it happened that Ralph's sketches or some other documents had to be duplicated in order to serve those responsible for the different types of drawings, plan sections, elevations and details, etc. Doing that became a most attractive task. It meant digging out a piece of copy paper. They were wrapped up in black in the bottom drawer. Wrap the original over the copy paper on a special frame. Climb up on deck. Make a decent, pretty proper assumption of the intensity of the sun. Expose the whole kit to the sun. And then rest leaning onto the mast for 5 to 10 minutes. After that, disassembling the kit and then drag the printing paper through a box, a metal box of stinking ammonia, and then hang it up in the rig for drying. So, after 3 to 4 weeks' work, we considered we had achieved something that reasonably well could be called the final design. Said and done, the hydroplane was called for again, and Ralph, with all the originals in a row, unresolved, all there is on tracing paper, made a spectacular jump from the aft of the barge onto the pontoon of the hull and took off up into the sky. A number of weeks later, back on ground in Rotting Hall, representatives of consultant partners, structural engineers, quantity surveyors, and not the least Twisted Whitley, local architect, who helped us with additional documentation. arrived and we had meetings, and so it went along. Then later in the afternoon, construction work started on site. The site manager, who turned out to be a keen gardener, shared his time between the construction work and his lavish flower boxes. So when Clare Hall actually was inaugurated and taken use of, I do not really know when it was 69. So. And then of course there was an addition made later, which we had, I don't know very much. But anyhow, in retrospect, after all, and for different reasons, I consider these 3 weeks in Kyrka as about the happiest in my life. Thank you, and more about Ralph and all he did after Clare in the afternoon.
I've got a critical question. Is the parrot the macaw? Is that
Oh yes,
really,
I
really a creature?
the parrot, he was of course the most important he was the actual captain of the ship, of course. He was very much alive, and he every now and then he was sitting there, turning his head like this, and then all of a sudden he gave up a terrifying scream, and we all were sitting drawing and went, so, and his name was of course Nelson. This is what it looked like afterwards, what we were actually doing. I think that's me standing there.
Fantastic. Marvellous. Thank you very much.
Well, first I just want to point out that these 2 words are not directly related separately to the individual. Ralph could never be called a disciplinarian, as you just heard. But I've been asked, or given the very nice task of talking about the Erskine approach. And these 2 words have certain meanings that I just want to explore in this. Now, I've used the project that I worked on in this photograph, which is the Biker project. This photograph was taken 10 years after we worked together on it. We're looking at a further project that you will see this afternoon. But the idiosyncrasy aspect of the work is something I think that would be given by many commentators or architecture students, because it wasn't typical of the day of modern architecture. Ralph had very strong convictions about the fact that, as you put it, architecture is the most factual of arts. And he felt it should be free of symbolism, expressionism, and also of monumentality. And it's very interesting when you look at his work here in Baker, this very different approach, this lighter, more joyous approach to architecture, a mixture of scales, non-monumental, the individual built and the family built into the fabric of the place. So the idiosyncrasy was actually, in many ways, a more relevant architecture. And much of that came from Ralph and the team, starting from a wider base than many architects did. Who were really interested in the building, and there's a now called an icon or a piece of symbolism. So this wider base also included the aspect of climate and climate related to community. What we were looking at in designing Baker was really how this could come to fruition within an existing community. Ralph had done certain work in communities, pulp mill communities in Sweden, but here he had an enormous community to work with, and an existing place. This is an architect of that place. All these slides, bar 2 of them, were taken by me in the late 70s, so that the scheme started to come to fruition physically. But this photograph is taken in the early 70s, and it just shows a certain type of discipline that the engineer and the drainage engineer paid to create in communities. Furrowed streets, long drainage paths, and packing them in housing in industrial communities. Baker was an existing community of shipbuilders, and it it was a very tight community in the city of Newcastle. It had a very strong identity. These people were strong. They were makers of things, makers of ships, and they were talkative, particularly to people from outside, and also talkative from other parts of Newcastle. They were quite separate in some ways. But the start of this was something of a revolution in architecture and planning. Ralph was a planner, and very proud to be a planner. And in many ways, he was one of the most inspiring urban designers, I think. But he started off not with a plan. He started off meeting the people of Byker. And he often said that architects generally come from the middle classes. And he was also from the middle classes, relatively well-off background. But in the sense of what he felt was that middle class people would not know an awful lot about people from different backgrounds. And therefore they should meet them, talk with them, find out what was important to them. And this is what he did. So with his team, which included effect, he went to meet people. These have become a bit of a revolution in Newcastle, because at the time of the 60s, most housing like this was called slums, which is a derogatory term to the people who actually lived in them. And they had to be told they had to move out to the north of the city, away from their work. They rebelled, said they weren't going. And they broke off from the politicians, and they created a group which headed his term Byker for Byker People. And Ralph met them, and with his team brought them together through the clergy in the community, and started to put together a statement of intent about how they would put a new settlement onto this particular site where they had lived for many generations. They presented that to the council. It was a very simple thin document. It wasn't a major tome. It was quite simply several pages just putting down the key things that were important to the community. Being able to find your way around easily, play spaces for children, safe pedestrian environments, good houses with gardens, low rise in character, and a feeling of enjoyment. So what Ralph then did, he went on to create the plan for Byker, the master plan. Now this really starts to show initially some of the discipline that Ralph brought to it. His climatic work, as Bengt outlined in Sweden, brought him to a view that this was important in designing on this site. Newcastle, as anybody who's lived there, like my wife and I and Bengt, is a very cold shoulder of the British Isles. It gets very cold climate in the winter, and it doesn't get very hot in the summer. When it does, it's welcomed by the people. So,
yes, in combination with the plan motivates, you must mention the plan that motivates.
yes, I was going to. Thanks, always been ahead of me, you know. What was important about this is the scale. This Byker is about as big as Marylebone, where I live in London. It's basically, if you take this as Baker Street, which runs through the middle of Marylebone, it's about 7 minutes walk to Edgware Road, and it's about 10 minutes walk to Portland Place. So it's a piece of London that has a characteristic and a unity. This is almost exactly the same. Raby Street, which formed the main spine of the existing location, with streets running down to it, is the central public and commercial place with public transport. And this is about a 10-minute walk time either way. And dotted in are the existing buildings that were kept. Belfort is very important to keep churches, add new schools into it, keep the Shipley Road baths, and churches were built into the wall. The project was highly influenced by the fact that it had a major area of infrastructure wrapping around the north of it, on the cold side of the plan. That was going to be an urban motorway. It's now a roadway, but not an urban motorway. It is a rail route. It is also a metro route. So the infrastructural zone was created. So the plan was basically to create a crescented sequence of buildings. It's got the nickname of the biker wall as a protective edge to the plan. But it had lots of other advantages. It kept out the noise, obviously. It identified bikers as a community. And it also gave a backdrop, a climatic and a visual backdrop to 80% of the site, which is low-rise. And this is primarily a two-story housing development. And 2 stories is not a scale most architects like to work in. They like to work in an upscale way rather than a downscale way. This climatic aspect came into fruition from what we know as the wall. And this is the north side of the wall, which as you see is a serpentine crescented building with different topography to create emphasis at gateways and points of connection to existing buildings and peaks at the point of the upper part of the topography. In other hands, this could have been a disaster of the building. And it has in many parts of modern architecture. Fort Ardwick in Manchester, which was done in brutalist concrete, was a very similar idea, but not with the genius or the enjoyment. So Ralph and his team created a tapestry basically out of it. A tapestry in common elements like brickwork, not in concrete, which people didn't like, even though architects did, in brickwork, in common material. This is all about a common architecture for people. On the inside of the wall, the sun opens up to the whole community. And the slopes then have a totally different meaning because the wall with its crescented forms creates bigger shapes which form areas to put greens, recreation spaces, children's play areas. And also, just as Patrick Geddes pointed out in its valley section of the city, a way that the community here in Baker were totally interconnected with their city. The city and the district, totally at one. Ralph was a copious drawer, and he drew in pencil primarily, some felt pen, but he drew everything. And everyone in the office was expected to draw everything. So it wasn't that you left it to someone else, you would have to draw it. And Ralph's way of working, as you probably saw in the photographs of Verona, and it was in the Biker office, which was a converted funeral parlour, was the fact you would work side by side. So you would work on flat tables like this, and when you start a design session working on a project, he'd work on one side, you'd work on the other, and somebody else might work on the other side. And you'd start sketching, and he would get very excited as you started to grow, but he would go through many, many choices and ways of doing it. And you were expected to do the same. And if you got a good idea, he would take it off you and say, you try that one, I'll try this. So he liked to interchange the ideas. But unlike many offices where the Grand Master stands at the top of the tree and hands down, and then there's somebody who does the ceiling layouts, somebody does the floor, somebody does the external wall. You did everything. It was a generalist office, and you learned the language of how to draw and how to express. But in this sense, you just see this is quite simply a courtyard room. And we used courtyards in Baker, as we did in many other projects, on the flat areas of the site, because they created definition, outdoor rooms surrounded by housing. And on the slopes of the site, we created terraces which looked one over the other, so that you've got this extra dimension of being able to see to very long distances from a simple two-story terrace. But here you can just see how the whole thing is animated, drawing people, drawing planting, drawing all the elements of life, children, play spaces, relaxation spaces. And this is not almost modern architecture. This is almost going back to common architecture. And Ralph talked about the importance of the community. And he said something very interesting. He said, the community is for people, but made by the people. It's, in many ways, he was saying it shouldn't be made by architects. And he said it is the most important thing. And that buildings are only a very small component of the community. There are many, many other things within it. So this sort of somehow, visually, to me, demonstrates that attitude and genius. This courtyard, which is one of the Kendall Street courtyards, is a very good example about that. How you bring buildings together in groups. Ralph, being a planner, an urban designer, in a very early sense, was very interested in how groups of buildings came together. How you create clement environments, warm microclimates, as he called it. So here you have a courtyard that is protective and protected. It forms street edges, and it forms its own semi-private, semi-public space. The public can walk through it, but it's not something you'd walk through easily. You'd feel you were actually not trespassing, but treading on other people's territory. Around the courtyard are 15 housing elements. And these are houses, homes, some of them two-storey in the centre, then others at the end on the wings, which could be either two-storey houses, three-bedroom, four-bedroom houses, or they could be one apartment or another. So you have this built-in flexibility. Ralph often said about monumentalism, it couldn't be adapted, and he wanted to create an architecture which could adapt with change, but people could change it. And of course, as we know in society today, different demographics of how housing needs to be divided because of, or used because of different types of families. These end pieces could be either family houses, or they could be more houses for smaller families, couples, individuals. So it was adaptable. And this is just the effect, looking from the street into the room. You feel as if it belongs to somebody. And it's very interesting, most of the landscape here is produced by the people who live there. So this ability to contribute to the environment they had a hand in shaping, but is still very much Ralph Erskine's architecture. They've had a hand in shaping it, was very important. And it has this sort of feeling of care, which so much of modern housing didn't have. And on the street edge, that forms the edge street with the gentle levels allowing you to come in, taking doorsteps. People actually starting to plant roses and climbers, which Ralph and all the team loved. He expected all architects to know a great deal about landscape architecture. He didn't see professions being separate. He felt you should know about the other profession and they should know about architecture. It was a very open-ended approach and way of working. When we got to the terraces, we moved away from courtyards onto the slope rather. And these slope houses were basically set on this 1 in 7, 1 in 8, 1 in 6 sometimes slope, but then gave them the ability to be entered at half level. They had, in many ways, their own sort of courtyard lanes because the fencing, which was part of the architecture, for me this was very interesting. I didn't expect to be making fences part of architecture, but it is part of the architecture that we experience in villages, nice towns, nice parts of towns, the walls and edges. So people went into their individual lanes and they had neighbours in the front, and then they had their own house. So in these groups, and this is the north side, which we painted black. This is the south side, which we painted white. When we got to the slope houses, it was probably in the mid-70s that this occurred. And as you see, most of light was polychromatic. It was full of colour, full of life, which was necessary in Ralph's and the team's view because Byker had been such a grey and dour place. And the people, when asked about colour, they said, of course we want a colourful environment. And they totally moved on to it. But when we got to the slopes, Ralph felt it was time to change the melody. So we created a black and white theme, which obviously was popular in Newcastle because their team plays in black. But it was really to do with that, I think. The interesting thing about this was Ralph was always a bit frightened that this part of the area would become Snob Hill. And in previous projects, he'd always been aware of that. If the houses were sold, these would be the houses that everybody wanted. And he didn't want that. He wanted a mixture of peoples in every area. The interesting thing about these houses is your living room is upstairs, so you look to the time, you look to the sun, the south and west, south and sun, and then to the gardens. And everything is brought alive. And in a place like Newcastle, it was important. So the reality of these shots that were just taken after the first planting season in about 1979 shows this indentation of some of the gables to actually create spaces outside where children could play, kick a ball around, you could sunbathe when the sun was out, as on a day like this. And then on the south side, you had the same thing. But because on the south side, as you moved into the development, into the piece, you then had other gables here. So you created relationships with everything. This visual communication, he felt, was so important. And then, as you're walking down the slope, you get this wonderful hill town event and feeling, where you get the Belvedere spaces where children play, or adults come out and relax and talk to each other in the tradition of the culture they come from. And you get this wonderful view, these sequence of wonderful views. So the actual visual aspects of how it all came together were very important to Ralph, because he felt it energised the people who used it. And it didn't impose architecture on them, it opened architecture up. He was interested in a far more open-ended environment. I just want to show you, everyone who worked for Ralph and everybody who's a client and friend got wonderful Christmas cards from him. And these were drawings that he'd done around Europe, usually, and they were primarily looking at settlements and how groups of buildings came together in beautiful settings, attractive settings, were very much about commonality and communality. And here in Lofoten, one of his favourite places in North Norway, you see the groups of buildings and the workplace interconnected. In southern Norway, you see a far more summery feeling of houses, two-storey houses, and their juxtapositions give you this real sense of this is an enjoyable place to live. And Baker was like that. It inspired his view of how new communities should come together. In Valletta, and in Modena in Malta, when he took a holiday there in 1996, and I was working with another project there, he produced these lovely sketches of how the topography means so much to the architecture. So this is almost an architecture out of topography. And then it has this sort of infinite sort of view to the sea. So Malta is always connected to the sea. And these wonderful cross streets, and then the major donals and churches and civic buildings. But this is very much Baker, because in Baker we did very simple buildings, and then we put appendages to them. And this was a discipline that wasn't just a predilection of Ralph's, it was a way to design economically. Because we didn't have lots of money to create indentations, sculptural buildings, like many of the brutalist buildings. This was about creating simple forms and pushing appendages out that gave people the outdoor space, gave them their view over the public domain or the street or the square. And here you see just this little thing that Ralph would have loved as he stopped in the street to take it and the spire at the end. And in Germany, the same thing, this idea of more common areas. One interesting thing about the photograph on the right-hand side is that Ralph believed in a modern time it was very difficult to design buildings with just hard surfaces between them. And he said it was really wonderful in medieval areas and historic areas where this could be done, because there'd been a culture of how to be in the public domain. But he was very keen on bringing landscape and greenery and birds and bees, as he put it, and natural things into the spaces between the buildings. And he became, in my view, a master of space between buildings, or living between buildings. This lovely sketch, also in South Germany, also shows this very important aspect as a team and everything that Ralph and his team did, of the topography of the building outline. Buildings were not flat-topped. in the Erskine way as they are today. I mean, we're a very cubic society in architecture today, or else we're a flyaway society with expressionism. He just loved the way the inhabited city formed a new topography. And Baker has that. When you go, you find this characterful, eventful, joyous topography. And he loved to draw interiors. This is just a guest house he stayed at in Cumbria. But we see here today that Ralph believed in pulling the scale of the interior down. In our architecture day, we are constantly putting space on steroids. We create big spaces for people to live in. Ralph talked about coziness, comfort, and this room we're in is about that. The eaves line drops, and many biker houses had living rooms in the roof with the roof line dropped to give an area of coziness or an area of more publicness, where you stood up or you sat down. So this ergonomic approach. And also the convivial spaces of crypts and vaulted spaces and lodges. When you did this drawing, we were doing a project for an underground system in London, and we were very inspired by traditional vaulted spaces, you'll see later. But the great thing for me, and I'm sure for Bengt and others, was that in going to work with Ralph, you found a language to work with. And it wasn't a sort of language that you'd expected. You found a language that was soft, made up of human elements, made up of landscape with the buildings, territories with the edges, facades not monumental, but inhabited by windows that told you which room they were. Today we see architecture which is basically floor to ceiling, wall to wall glazing. We've read about the difficulties when you're next to a major public building, of everybody being able to see in and see out, but that's what high tech does. That's what you do for an office building or a housing building. Well, these are houses. These are houses where people have different activities in different places. Ralph said something very interesting, that he said that architects should not design homes. He said they should design houses that can easily be good houses, that can easily be made into good homes by the people who live in them. This is very different to the residential real estate we see today, which is primarily about selling the dream home. So you get your home, you don't get the house that you can make the home. And that's what, and people are paying for this.
A lot.
So the landscape and the integration of landscape, building forms, and routes. This is a totally pedestrian environment, I think. It has cars. We had to design it with cars of 1.25 cars per person. In the 1970s, no one in Baker had a car. They walked to work, they walked to the shops, they walked to the pub, they walked to the social club, they walked to church. Nobody had a car. So we pushed the cars to the edge on the outside of the wall where the infrastructure was, and only had very small penetrations into the building. It's very interesting today in architecture and urban design how pedestrianisation has become another thing. And maybe it's because cyclists have made it another thing too. Providing for the cyclists is now so important. And I recently visited Vauban in Freiburg in Germany, which has very similar characteristics to Baker in the way that the pedestrian and the cyclist dominate, and cars have to pay attention to how the activities of those people are working. So routes through shortcuts, being seen and seeing, and being able to find a sequence around your environment, but not an obvious one like furrows of the Victorian streets, but an enchanting one, a place where things would change, climatic changes, changes in skylight, just changes in who you'd see. All these lovely incidents that make up a community. And the language of the architecture was counterpoint to the language of most architects, and hence the idiosyncrasy that many people attribute to the Erskine office. This was made up of small informal elements, pieces of timber, metal, seats, doorsteps, coverings, translucent coverings, and views and verandas. We've seen in the 60s the streets in the sky of Park Hill, Robin Hood Gardens, and the Fort Ardwick in Manchester, and obviously the disasters that they created. This is a human way of designing access. The access deck is still one, in my view, of the best ways of getting to a number of dwellings and creating neighbours in the outdoor spaces rather than in corridors. And so, and in this sense, the social aspect of the community was broken down, not built up. So rather than having 100 people off this street in the sky, you just had 7 or 10 people who could access it. So you got to know them. And in many cases in Baker, families and relatives moved into, in sequence, into the different verandas. So you had a good social grouping. And then you had the care that they gave it. And then, obviously from the street, even though the wall is a big building, it's broken down into small elements all the time. And this idea of breaking it down into smaller human elements was a constant in the discipline that the Erskinites were. The language had the two-sidedness of the wall, but Ralph was always a person who believed in the architecture of the art of that which is useful, not that which is used less. So here on the outside of the wall, if people were moving through and you had a pram, you could walk up next to the staircase. You didn't have to put in an enormous ramp. People who had children were usually fit and wanted to move quickly. And then on the inside, so this was formed a decorative thing out of the bricks, etc. On the inside, you had this appendages, as we saw in the letter sketch, of human elements, the galleries, the pergolas, and the greenery. This side, I could have no greenery in it at all up to this new place being formed. It was a totally hard area.
There were 6 trees. Micah had, I think it was 4 telephones, 5 bathrooms, and 6 trees. And they were all up at the churchyard, the trees.
Yes. As you can guess, Ben was ahead of me, so there we are. But this is the sort of beauty of the place. And people used to love this idea of the birds. We even produced bird boxes, you may see on the slope housing, for the birds to inhabit. But they had lots of other places as well. One of the major disciplines of this project, but also one of the great benefits of it, it wasn't all done at once. And this created a really taxing situation for the community. Because they knew they would get housed, but they didn't quite know where. So depending on where you lived, because obviously the wall area was created by the clearance for the motorway, so we could get density into it. This is Raby Street, as it was in the mid-70s, as it was in the early 70s, with elements starting to create. So this is the environment people had to live in. So it was a great act of faith to be able to get them to keep moving along with it. And as you see, it's like building Maryland or Belgravia by the Cubits. So it was a major piece, and it put a great discipline on the people who worked there, the architectural team, because they lived and worked within the place. One of the things that is, in my view, most important in the Erskine approach is the creation of intimate spaces. This is the part of architecture that has gone away altogether. We create big spaces, big buildings, and this is the joyous thing about creating connections. Clare Hall is a perfect pilot for the intimate spaces between buildings. Ralph Erskine's great friend Jan Gale in Copenhagen, who wrote the book Living Between Buildings, this was his perfect environment. He used to come and visit regularly with students. So these areas where people could look over, walk through, the spaces where children could play, connect through to different homes, the protected spaces outside dwellings, in gardens, breaking down the space, and also just the territories. This is a picture that I didn't take, but I love it, because basically it's by a woman artist who did an exhibition here at Baker and Clare Hall called Andrea Bozinski. And she captured on a sunny day, which you may only get 10 in Newcastle, but they're worth it. The rooms we made to the hobby rooms here were all made out of timber. So the inhabitants of that house has figured out timber doesn't heat up like a metal roof, so they can use it. It's got basically a sloping sun deck. and it's about 17.5 degrees, which is what you put photovoltaics on. So it's about the best place you could get a suntan in the northeast of England. Thank you very much.